Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. I first encountered Constantine Cavafy in Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet, where the old poet represented the ghostly voice of the city. I was immediately attracted to the dreamlike quality of his poems and the way he captured a sense of melancholy that I've always felt. Cavafy wrote about human desire, inglorious epochs of Greek history, and civilizations in decline, using plain, factual descriptions undressed by metaphor. He never published his poems in a book, but circulated carefully chosen specimens in broadsheets that he printed himself. And yet this seemingly isolated man, living in an obscure post-colonial backwater, became the best-known Greek poet in the world today. How did a writer who showed such little promise in his youth find a place in the literary canon? I'm joined by Gregory Jusdanis, co-author of Constantine Cavafy, a New Biography. He also teaches modern Greek and comparative literature at The Ohio State University. We spoke about Cavafy's childhood of faded aristocratic grandeur, the Mediterranean Greek world he grew up in, and his lifelong poetic preoccupations. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that this podcast relies on the support of listeners like you to keep going. The entire thing is a one-man show. I do everything myself, from research, sourcing new materials, the massive amount of reading, the interviews, the editing, the post-production, and the promotion. I do all that outside my day job, which is writing. But I can't keep funding an unpaid job using what I earn from paid work. If you don't want Personal Landscapes to fade away like Greek Alexandria, then please consider joining my members club. You'll be supporting an independent, ad-free podcast that publishes carefully curated conversations, backed by decades of reading. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com to find out more. And now, here's my conversation with Gregory Jusdanis on Constantine Cavafy, the poet of Alexandria. I suspect some of my listeners may not be familiar with his work, so who was Constantine Cavafy?
So Cavafy now is regarded as one of the top 3 or 4 European poets of the 20th century. I think if you ask most people for the top poets, I think Cavafy will be one of them. He was born in Alexandria in Egypt in 1863 and died in Alexandria in 1963 on the day of his birthday. He came from a family of Greek merchants who had been invited from Istanbul. His family, then there was a large Greek community in Istanbul, and they were invited in the 1850s and 60s in order to help develop the cotton trade in Egypt. Many of the Greeks settled in Alexandria and turned Alexandria into a major Greek city. There were many other Europeans as well, but the Greek community was really the dominant one. They set up schools, social clubs, restaurants, cafes, gymnasia, all the accoutrements of a society, and including a thriving literary culture that rivaled Athens. I mean, Athens was a bigger city. I would say Athens' literary culture was more extensive, but for a provincial city, Alexandria's was really, really major, and it produced Cavafy and other writers, poets, and artists.
So how did you first encounter his work?
Well, I immigrated to Canada from Greece, and I studied classics at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And one of my professors read to me Cavafy's poem, Waiting for the Barbarians, and I was really so taken by him that when I went to Greece, it was then much more difficult to travel. I bought his poems in Greek. It was difficult to read them because he combines both what's called the demotic, the vernacular language, with the puristic, a more sort of archaic language that preserves some of the features of classical Greek. And so I read him, and then when I did my PhD, I decided to do it on the poetics of Cavafy, that is his theory of literature, and that was my first book. And then I put Cavafy to the side. I wrote other books on nationalism, on friendship, on the importance of art in life, until my colleague Peter Jeffries, who had been working on Cavafy during all his careers, invited me to write his biography, and that's how we both came to write the biography, a project that took some time to write. And it's writing a biography is a different type of writing, because in the academy and when you write scholarly books, you're proving something, you're demonstrating a case. For example, in my case, say the development of nationalism, and in biography, you really are narrating a story. So it's something between fiction, writing a novel, and doing sort of discursive writing.
So how did it work doing this with a co-author? I mean, how did you divide? I've never worked with a co-author before, so how did you divide it up? And
Yeah, so that was the first thing we discussed, and it's one of the most popular questions that we get. So we decided first on that the only way we could do is actually write the biography thematically rather than chronologically. So the usual practice in biographies is what's called cradle to grave. You begin with the birth and die with the death of the subject. We decided, since this was going to be a shared project, that we couldn't divide it chronologically. So I take 0 to 45, and my colleague takes 45 until, the Cavafy died. So we did it. So this is the reason then why we wrote it thematically. We also wrote it thematically as well, because we felt you could create and control more the narrative arc. When you're reading sort of chronological biographies, you can see that the writers are really determined or based by the passing of time. But by writing each chapter separately, we could create what I thought was a more interesting narrative arc, that you are not bound by in a sense, chronometer of Cavafy's age, but by our own interests and what we thought the interests of our audience and the readers would be.
yeah, it's a really interesting approach too, because it really gives you an opportunity to flesh out the world that he lived in and the things that were
Yeah.
happening all around him.
Absolutely. For example, in the reviews that we got, one of the aspects of the book that people really liked was that in the section dealing with Alexandria, we have many pages devoted to Cavafy going out, walking through, sauntering through the city, talking to people, going to various institutions, cafes, theaters, bookstores. And in so doing, we give a little history of Cavafy and of Alexandria. That we would not have been able to do had we written the book chronologically. It would have been it wouldn't have been logical. It just didn't make sense to devote so much space to his sauntering through the city. Whereas now, he becomes alive as he parades through the city. So there are many. And then we could show, for example, the development of his poetic journey, how he began writing poetry as a young man, how in his middle age he did something that, as you would understand, Ryan, something that horrible for a writer. He renounced most of what he had written to begin a new journey, a new way of writing. So I felt we could give a more meaningful account of his development as a poet, as a writer, if we devoted a chapter to that. We have a chapter on the family, a chapter then on how he not only developed as a poet, but how, in a sense, he became such an influencer before the idea of influence in the way that we understand it in the internet age, that he built readers one by one. So we felt then by writing thematically, we could give a more interesting and a fuller story, especially since his life was not interesting per se. I read a very good biography of Van Gogh that was not Rimbaud, sorry, that was
Hmm.
published last year. And there you could see, there are travels involved. And, and Cavafy never left Alexandria after middle age, except to go to Athens in his final years to go for surgery. So if the life itself is not interesting, you have to make the story interesting. So this is why we wrote it thematically.
Well, it's really effective too, because he's so closely tied to the city of Alexandria, and his work is so closely tied to what was happening at that time, sort of in an indirect way, which is really interesting. There's these themes of decline and
Yes.
the past. So tell me more about his family background. Where did he come from? What sort
So
of place did he grow up in?
so he came, as I said, from the family originated from Istanbul. They were bankers, and they came to Alexandria. The father and his uncle came to Alexandria in order to develop the cotton trade, and they were very well connected with the Hellenic diaspora all over the Mediterranean and with Liverpool and London. So when Cavafy was born, he was born to one of the richest families in the Middle East. The father, it is said that during the American Civil War, when there was an embargo on cotton being traded from the southern United States to England, it was Cavafy and the other Greeks that ramped up cotton production so much that, in a sense, the missing cotton from the States was actually replaced. And for this service, he was going to be knighted because he was a British subject, but he died. Unfortunately for the Cavafy family, the death of the father sent the family's finances, as we say here, south. They experienced then disturbance. The brothers were not financially talented. They were all, to a certain extent, talented in the arts, not the same as Constantine, but they certainly were. So they had no talent for business. So the mother took all the children, first to Liverpool, then London, brought them back, but they faced financial decline, and Cavafy and the brothers then confronted and always felt the shame of having been at the top and then becoming, in a sense, middle class. They were always accepted by the rich Greeks and the other rich Europeans, but they never felt they were part of that. And Cavafy turned this memory into his poem. And I think one of the reasons then he believed so passionately in his art, you don't want to reduce the poetry to financial decline, but I think he wanted to distinguish himself so much that for this and many other reasons, he decided to become a great poet. And one of them was he never forgot where he came from. He always thirsted to be invited to weddings, to dinners of the wealthy Alexandrian citizens. And he always, in a sense, was very proud of this. And he was a name dropper. And he would say, oh, I was invited to so-and-so and try this. So-and-so sent this to me. He always wanted to demonstrate that he was still accepted by the rich citizens of Alexandria, including the Benaki family. So if you or your listeners have been to Athens, you'll know that the Benaki Museum is really one of the best comprehensive museums in Greece, and they also have one of the foremost collections of Islamic art in the world. That was started by Alexander Benaki. He had the foresight to move to Athens because he saw more than any other Greeks that their time was up in England. The Cavafy brothers had no such talent. And I would say that if we look at this from the point of view of world literature, although the Cavafy family lost, we who love literature gained, because instead of having a Cavafy museum in Athens, as we have the Benaki Museum, we have Cavafy's poetry.
When you say he came from wealth, this is a background with servants, tutors, governesses,
Absolutely.
a chauffeur,
Chauffeurs, everything.
fine furniture. He grew up speaking 3 languages,
Yes,
I believe.
absolutely. They
English,
would
French, and Greek.
vacation in Europe. They had nothing lacking. Grand houses. And so when people visited his house on Rue Lepsius, this was his final apartment, he showed off this Victorian furniture, the grand Victorian furniture that he had inherited and he had a memory of. So his poetry is really very much of memory, not only of memory of thinking back to the happiness of youth, the fullness of youth, but thinking back to the time of grandeur.
Do you think his family's reduced circumstances, that sort of faded aristocratic grandeur that surrounded him, is that what sparked some of his interest in writing about civilizations in decline?
Yes, I would say so, that there is a connection between his own family decline and his interest in what are known as periods of decline in Hellenic civilization. For example, Cavafy was one of the first people to really think about the Hellenistic period and the decline. That is the period of Alexander the Great, who took Greek culture all the way almost to Afghanistan. and also the period of late antiquity, that is the 2nd and 3rd century AD, or as we say now, the Common Era. People were not interested in these areas. If you look at what Greek poets and writers and Greeks were interested in at that time, it was 5th century Athens, the time of Pericles, Demosthenes, Plato, Aristotle. This is what we think then is the fountainhead of Western civilization. This is what readers wanted. Cavafy was interested in a period of decline when Greek culture was mixing with the other cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean and was mixing with other cultures and other societies of the Middle East. So I would say there is a connection between the social and economic fall that he felt as an individual and the decline that he thought was so interesting in Hellenic culture. So he was less interested in the purity when Greek culture was at its height, when most people would associate with, which most people would associate with the Acropolis, with the Parthenon, with Aristophanes, with Pericles. But when Greek culture would mingle with others and, in a sense, make something new. And this is why I think, and I have said elsewhere, that Cavafy, in a sense, foresaw in taking an interest in this time of globalization of the Hellenistic period and the period of late antiquity, of racial, ethnic, and religious mixing and fusion, that he foresaw our modern age of globalization, multiculturalism, polyethnicity, and so on.
So you said that when his father lost all the money, that they spent some time in Liverpool and then London, and that the family possessed a British ethos. He saw himself as culturally British. In what way? So how did this time in England shape his social, cultural, and literary tastes?
Right. So keep in mind that these were the elite, sort of the Greeks that were living in Alexandria, and the other Europeans in Alexandria. Although the Greeks had a very strong sense of national self, and especially the elites, they learned French, they spoke French, and they spoke English because these were the cultures that they aspired to. And in fact, if you look at the memoirs of, say, Penelope Delta, who was Benaki's sister, she would say that they always spoke French at home because this is what we're doing. So the Cavafy family, because the father had British nationality, then always tended and aspired towards England. And he had a rather peculiar way of speaking that was inflected, I think, by his stay in England. So he spent then his formative years, so many years, in Liverpool and in London, and he was fluent in English. He wrote to his brother often in English and wrote poetry. They wrote verses to one another in English, even when they were very, very, very young. So I would say that was the culture that they aspired to, sort of British Victorian culture. And so much of his upbringing is of this Victorian culture. So when people see, for example, there is a very famous photograph of Cavafy as a young boy wearing in what looks like a dress, and people think, oh, this is the mother, she made him gay. But that was the way that Victorian boys were often portrayed, in something that looked like a dress. So they were raised as British. And so much of the family that was living that had established themselves in England was British, had endowed British institutions, formed relationships with the elite of Britain. So I would say that to a certain extent, his temperament was British.
So what would he have been reading at that time? Would he be mostly reading British or English literature, or would it be leavened with Greek as well?
I would say he was reading then French literature. He was reading British literature. He was well-versed then in British literature. And as he got older, he began to read more than the literature of antiquity, because that's another dominant theme of his work. People said that he knew the Greek historian Plutarch by heart. So I think after a while he stopped reading modern literature and devoted himself to classical literature because he wanted to place his people, his characters, with great detail and make them believable. So he would spend years researching a poem and making sure that he got the details right. So I would say initially he was very much influenced by French and British literature. And of course, obviously, he knew Greek literature. But after a while, I think on the basis of our research, we can see that he concentrated on reading the classics and classical history.
So Cavafy formed his closest friendships in his younger years. He seemed a very different person then, one who was actively interested in the lives of his friends and their well-being. So what role did those early friendships play, and how did they influence his writing?
Right. I would say that, one of our goals was to, in a sense, investigate and try to determine motivations to the extent that we can tell the motivations of anybody. And I can sit here and talk with anyone that it's very difficult to determine. But let's assume, and we need, in order to live, we need to believe that we know other people's motivations, that I'm interested in your life, and I know why you're interested in doing the podcast. So why we wanted to know. And that was my goal from the beginning, because Cavafy as an adult was portrayed as a very cold, self-interested person who believed only in his art. But we wanted to see what he was like as an adolescent and as a youth. And when we looked in the material provided in the archive, we saw that there was a totally different person. He was a very loving young man who, in a sense, wrote tenderly to his friends. And although, and this is, of course, something that we mourn, is most people did not keep his letters. He kept everybody's letters. So we only have very few of his letters in comparison. But we know in the exchanges that he had, and in the answers that were written to him, that, he was a warm person. And we have the record of a diary he kept of his young friend, Mikes, who died of typhoid fever in his early 20s. And we also have a record we also have the diary that he kept over the death of his mother. And in both cases, we see someone who's really very, very conscious, very disturbed by the state of Mikes, who anxiously goes to his house to visit him, pleads for the doctor to go there. This is not the person. And also in the diary of his mother, this is that he really loved his mother, took care of her, became anxious over his illness, read to her a French short story in order to calm her. This is not the person that we see that comes out in the representations of others, say in middle age and afterwards, and in what he was saying about himself. So for me, I was really interested to know what happened to him, what happened to that very loving and tender young man who became someone who was possessed with art, who strived for greatness, who gave up, as we say in the book, love in the pursuit of the great ideal, which is to become a world poet.
The older Cavafy that you describe in the book seems like a very different man who seldom took an interest in the lives of those who helped him most. And it's you talk about how he would entertain visitors at his apartment, and it almost seemed like a performance. Like he obsessed over controlling the lighting, always candles, or he served a particular quality of drink depending on the status of the guest.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I should say that his house, especially when he became famous, became almost like a site of pilgrimage for anybody visiting Egypt. Anybody from anywhere would always go to his house, and he was really open. And this is what I loved about that society, which is so different from ours. He was always open for people to visit him in the afternoon. You just knew there. You didn't have to go. You just, and if he wasn't there, you just left your visiting card. So that person was a charming host. He was a brilliant conversationalist. People loved going to his house, but he was really the Sphinx in that he was impenetrable. Both his face and his soul was hidden from others. And people would write. They wanted to go and meet the real Cavafy, but only saw the mask. So interestingly, he would place candles in front of his interlocutors, but he kept his face in darkness. He wanted to observe, but not to be observed. And as you know, there is power. We know in the age, during COVID, when, I had classes, I hated when people had their dark screens because, they could see me, but I couldn't see them. So this gives you a sense of a sense of power. So this is the contradiction. And I think a biography should bring out the contradictions in someone, because all of us, you and I, all are full of contradiction. We're not just one person. So we wanted to bring both the side that he was, in a sense, happy to receive others. As I said, he was a sumptuous host, worried about the details of what he was offering, but there was no self-revelation. There was no access to his soul. That he kept hidden. And in fact, Erika Sengopoulos, who in a sense was the only woman in his life, she married Aleko Sengopoulos, who became then his literary heir, and they lived in the apartment in the flat below, and they took care of him. At the end, and they were the heirs to all the archives. When she had the intention of writing the biography originally and had access to his papers, she couldn't believe what she was reading, because this is not the Cavafy that she knew. It was another person. So the question is, what happened to him? Why did he change? And some of the suppositions that we propose are, I think, the deaths in the family. He lost all his brothers, his parents, close friends, one by one. So death constantly knocked at his door. I think dealing with his own homosexuality, and even though he was always open, and he, more than any other contemporaneous poet, spoke openly about gay love, queer love in the poetry, it still was hard for him in the beginning come to terms with it, to his family and to himself. He never had a life partner. I'm sure he would have wanted one, but never did. So I think the social decline is another reason that perhaps he withdrew into himself. But first and foremost, I think it was that overriding ambition for greatness, to do something extraordinary, to do something for posterity, that made him, in a sense, give that up. He had that sort of that pact with the devil, so to speak. I'll give this up if you give me fame. A lot of people do it, but only a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of the people who do it actually gain. And he was one, and he won spectacularly in this pact that he made sort of with Mephistopheles. So these are the reasons that I think can explain his psychology, the type of person that he is. And that leads me to question and to think about all people that attain something, whether they're Musk or a particular leader, who give up on what most of us would think is personal happiness for this overall ambition. And so I think, we gain some insights into greatness when we write about greatness.
You've got some great descriptions in the book as well from people who visited his flat. I just want to mention this one I really liked. You say visitors described him as being like a lithograph that had descended from its frame. So someone who was born an old man almost. He really seemed out of his time.
He did, and for many people, there was another visitor who felt that he came from another time and place. And I think that was perhaps deliberate. He wanted to project, to see himself as otherworldly. He wanted people to think of him as an interesting person. And he was, in a sense, a social influencer a century before that concept became popular, because it's hard to believe, but people in Alexandria, or they like merchants, people working in stores, waiters, heard of Constantine Cavafy. Even if they had not read the poetry, they heard of him because he had created this interesting persona, that a person with a sort of fascinating apartment that was full, that was like an antiquarian shop. And people felt when they passed that border from the outside into the inside, it was like going from the outside into a church. It was like going almost into a museum, something that was whimsical, something where art was practiced, where poetry was created. And they felt themselves changed. And when they came out of the apartment, They felt, and they went into this ordinary world. They went from the aesthetic realm into the dirt and sounds of Alexandria on the street. So I think he deliberately created this image because he wanted people to be interested in him. He wanted people to talk about him. And he did that by gaining one reader at a time, which is something very hard for us to believe when what we want is how many tweets, how many hits, how many subscribers somebody has. That's an indication of influence. Or for him, it was really just going one by one.
So I'd like to know more about the Mediterranean Greek world that he grew up in. It seems to me, do I have this correctly, that a handful of cities, Athens, Constantinople, Smyrna, Thessaloniki, and Alexandria, were kind of the centers of Greek expat life. So what were relations like between these places? How literarily and commercially?
Right. So when Cavafy's parents moved to Alexandria, they were then Ottoman citizens because they were living in Istanbul, in Constantinople. So they had contact then with fellow family members and merchants all over the Mediterranean, not only in the cities that you mentioned, Smyrna and Athens and Thessaloniki, but other European cities like Livorno and Marseille, London and Liverpool. So they were part of what we call the Hellenic diaspora, this Hellenic extension. And Cavafy never felt himself part of Greece. He didn't see himself part of Greece. He saw himself part of this Hellenic extension, this diaspora, and wrote about this diaspora. He too could have followed the Benakis to Greece. He didn't. He felt more at home in Alexandria. He felt the freedom to think and work in Alexandria, which didn't have a national identity to impose upon him. And that's another reason that people are interested in him, because he was interested again in these extensions, less the nation state than the extension of the people that live outside of the nation state, who are not beholden to one particular national identity. And he tried to make a connection between the Hellenic diaspora of his time, of people living in that extension that you described, and Hellenic culture in the Hellenistic period and the time of Greek antiquity that was not limited to Greece, and in fact was more interesting by that time outside of Greece, because Hellenic culture was mixing then with the Egyptian, the Near Eastern, the Indian, the Bengali, etc. That's what interested him. So this is why, as I said, he never returned to Greece after his trips in 1903. Mm-hmm.
I suppose that's quite a clever strategy as well when it comes to creating his own, this aura around himself. Like living abroad is a bit like that. Like you become a sort of distant figure and people project things onto you. I've seen that in my own life. I mean, my friends back home imagine me living a very different, far more exotic sort of traveling life than the dull reality of reading and writing. So being at one remove kind of almost allows people to project things onto him, and the image is harder to puncture, I guess.
Absolutely, and it's harder, and it's harder to define him as Greek. He himself saw himself as a Greek Egyptian. So I would think there are two things here, and I think this is why contemporary readers, many of them who feel themselves transplants, migrants, immigrants, people that don't belong to a particular place, feel drawn to him because this is what he talked about. And then again, as you said, it was much more difficult for people to pinpoint him. He never strived to become a national poet in the way they say that Tennyson was, or the way that his contemporary in Greece was Palamas, that is someone who speaks for the nation. He never wanted to speak for the nation. After all, look at the subjects. The subjects were, young men who would go into same-sex brothels. That type of poetry could never become national poetry. So it was his image as an outsider, as a Greek of the diaspora, gave him the freedom to think and maneuver. And also, I think, as you said, this, in a sense, explains in part his popularity. When you think, he wrote in a time when there were only about 6 million Greek speakers. And so when you come and you write in a language that's less frequently spoken It's much more difficult for a poet or a writer to become famous. Imagine now writing in German or Spanish or French. It's much easier to get an international audience than it is if you're writing, say, in Swahili, in Albanian, or even Greek right now. So for him to become such a major old poet, writing not even in Athens, but in Alexandria and in Greek, which was then, as I said, a minor language, is in a sense a recognition of his own genius and the way that he positioned himself into world literature.
So you said that Greek poetry at this time was focused on patriotic subjects, national identity, the ascent of the Greek nation, and the glorious epochs of 5th century Athens and these sorts of things. But were, as you said earlier, his subjects were not that. His were the outlying places, the fringes, the decline, the inglorious years. So what did Greek readers at the time make of this?
Well, this was really interesting. So we should also say that at that time in Greece, the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century was defined by a struggle by two different linguistic movements. One was the Demotic, that is people that were supporting the Demotic, the vernacular, as the language of the nation and as the language of poetry and of literature, and others that were supporting Katharevousa, which is a puristic language, a modern language, but based in a sense on the ancient language. So there was this a struggle going on. And Cavafy wrote in a mixture of the two, which made his poetry seem strange. And he didn't write about national themes. He didn't write about Greece per se at all. After writing about Homeric themes, which was another popular theme then of Greek poets and of Western poets, so he wrote about, say, Ithaca. So when he wrote about Homeric themes, he decided to abandon them. He returned to what were the inglorious periods of Greek history, which was the Hellenistic period, the time of Alexander, the period of late antiquity when Greece and all of the Greek world came under Roman control, and also the period of Byzantium, which people rejected as an aberration in the West, rejected as an aberration. And so he was writing about Greek periods that nobody was interested in, and certainly not in Greece. And then he was writing these personal poems about decline, and gradually more and more, he was revealing more of the erotic self of men loving men. So in the beginning, people didn't know what to do with this poetry. And it's interesting then that perhaps he became, like most often, more popular abroad than he was first in Greece. But gradually he became accepted, but it took some time.
So I want to come back to this difference in language between Demotic and Katharevousa, is that right?
Katharevousa, coming from like the word pure, so it was called a puristic language.
So what does it sound like? Like, would I be able to hear the difference?
And you would be able, in terms of sound, I don't think you'd be able, because the Greeks of today would pronounce it the same way, but the grammar was different. The words sometimes were different. They wanted to go back to word endings from the classical period. So the grammar, if you were to read it, you would see the difference. But hear it, I don't think it quite. And that Katharevousa was the official language of the Greek state until 1976, which means Greece, from the time, from the Greek War of Independence, in a sense, 1821 to 1976, experienced what was called diglossia, which is the contemporaneous presence of two different registers of the same language. That is the Demotic, the vernacular, and this puristic language. So it's not bilingualism, as in Canada, where you have French and English, but diglossia in the way that you get in many Arab countries, where you have modern standard Arabic at the top and the vernacular of of Moroccan Arabic or Tunisian Arabic. So that's what Greeks experienced. And at one point then, all of Greek poets felt they would write in the Demotic, in the language of the people in the vernacular. Cavafy went against then this current by including Katharevousa words. Not only that, he actually cited passages and words from classical Greek. So sometimes you could read a poem and you can see the whole of the Greek tradition cited in that particular poem a type of poetry that seemed bizarre and jarring to Greek readers, because by that time they really wanted demotic. So he was giving them not only katharebusa, the puristic language, but also ancient Greek thrown at them. In fact, there is a poem called, in the month of Aether, in the month of Hathor, where the speaker looks at an ancient inscription. It's an imaginary scene, and he begins to read from the ancient inscription, providing in square brackets the parts that are and the stones that are broken. So in a sense, those people that know ancient Greek could actually read that, because half the poem is in ancient Greek. So he was interested very much in the whole of the Greek linguistic tradition and actually contained it in his work. And as I argue, I think another mark of his genius is that he, in a sense, made the Greek language strange to contemporaneous Greek readers, so they often felt that they were reading a translation rather than the original. And in fact, this is the difficulty of translating Cavafy. You cannot translate the different sort of registers of the Greek language that he quotes. Like, what can you do? Can you do it, say, if we're translating in English that poem, do you do it in Anglo-Saxon? Is that, it just doesn't work in that same way. So, when we translated, we opted then for doing away with that. But you miss, in a sense, that reading the poem, you're reading, half the poem is in ancient Greek. And that is, in a sense, lost. But I think the capacity to make Greek readers think about their own language, to take a distance from their own language and think about it, and give them a sense that they were almost reading a translation rather than the original, is, as I said before, a mark of his genius in what he was doing. He was not only changing poetry, but asking people to think about the language.
That's really interesting, and that's something you miss entirely in English. But at the same time, when we read a Cavafy poem today, we immediately know it's him. And not just because of the subject, but also because of the way he wrote. And W.H. Auden said that Cavafy doesn't use simile or metaphor. Whether he's speaking of a scene, an event, or an emotion, Auden says, every line of his is plain factual description without any ornamentation whatsoever.
And this is why he's very right. And this is why people originally in Greece rejected his poetry, because they expected poetry to dance. They expected metaphor. They expected adjective. They expected then simile. And Cavafy was on record as saying that he hated the adjective. So his poetry was seen as very pedestrian. It was prosaic to many people, and one person called it historical reportage, that it really wasn't poetry. And somebody could say, well, let me just take a piece of prose and let me write it in this way, and you can see that I too can write a Cavafyan poem. What they did not know, and I think as we show in the book and others have shown, is the great deal of poetic value that he put into meter, into the sound of words, the placement of words, and those come out, I think, in the translation. Auden is right that people can read a Cavafy poem in English or in French and Spanish and immediately recognize it as Cavafyan, which is another example of then his own great originality, that he created not only a different type of poetry, but a different type of world that now we recognize as Cavafyan.
Mm. You said that his work's emotional energy lay in evocations, dreams, illusions, and feelings. Can you give me an example?
Yes, there is the poem called The Afternoon Sun, where the speaker goes into, well, actually, let me read. The famous poem was The Walls, that many people, since this is what I have here, that many people can associate with, as the person of the closed space. He says, without consideration, without pity, without remorse, they built high, thick walls around me. And now I sit here in despair, thinking of nothing else. This fate eats away at me because I had so much to do outside. Oh, why didn't I pay attention when they were building the walls? Yet I didn't hear any sound or noise from the builders. imperceptibly, they closed me off from the outside world. So here he tells us then how he is, in a sense, closed off from the outside world, and he is a person of the internal space. I'm just trying to find here the afternoon. Ah, yes, here it is. So this is the one that really evokes. So the afternoon sun is a poem about someone who enters a space that is now used, say, as an office or a store.
Yeah.
And he remembers years earlier that he had experienced love in this. So as I'm reading it, think about how he describes here an act of memory. He says, the afternoon sun, and this was published 1918-19, this room, how well I know it. Now it and the one next to it are rented out as offices. The entire house has become commercial space for brokers, businessmen, and companies. This room, how familiar it is. Here, near the door, the sofa stood, and in front of it, a Turkish rug. Nearby, the shelf with 2 yellow vases. To the right, no, opposite, a wardrobe with a mirror. In the middle was the table where he wrote, and 3 large wicker chairs. Next to the window stood the bed, where we often made love. These poor things must still be somewhere. Yes, next to the window stood the bed. The afternoon sun covered half of it. Notice here how he enters the space which is now used as an office. But for him, this is special because he remembered that he made love there. And what he tries to recreate here is to evoke through memory the feelings that he experienced. And what does he remember? That the sun covered half the bed in the afternoon. And as I say to my students when we read it, you only remember something if it's important to you. I doubt that many of the students in 30 years would remember my classroom. But the fact that he does shows us how significant, how this was imprinted in his mind, in a sense, this afternoon space. And so I would say, yeah, this is one of the poems that, in a sense, gives us this evocation of space and memory and desire. And that is, in a sense, really Cavafian.
Yeah, it's interesting how he layers in the past into a present space that bears no current resemblance to that past, too. Because Alexandria was a bit like that. I went there for a magazine story years ago. I was looking for traces of Lawrence Durrell's fictional world, and there aren't many Hellenic remains in Alexandria, unlike a place like Istanbul. So Cavafy, you say, had to seek the past in imaginary underground towns and in the veiled spaces of his apartment.
So, and this is one of the reasons, paradoxically, he chose Alexandria. So what we wanted to say that modern Alexandria is built over Hellenistic Alexandria. So unlike Rome or Athens, where you can go in and see the classical monuments, there is really nothing to see in Alexandria. Very little has been uncovered. The Roman theater, some of the catacombs, an ancient pillar is all there is. And even the museum did not have the best examples of ancient art. The vases, as E.M. Forster said, were not spectacular examples of classical art. But this Cavafy saw as a gain, because this enabled him to create the past in his mind and to fashion it more freely. So when people asked him, hey, why didn't you move to Athens, or why don't you move to someone like Paris and London where you could be more free? But he thought, no, although maybe sexually he could have been more free, though I doubt it, but at least in terms of his imagination, he was not determined by the sight of the Acropolis every day or of the Colosseum and the Forum in Rome. So because there was nothing or very little, he could evoke it and create it in his mind more freely. And that really also explains both what the original aspect of his work and why he continued to stay in what people saw was a provincial city in the Mediterranean.
You've got a great quote from the biography where you sum that up so well. You say that Cavafy's poetic Alexandria was a place and at the same time a no place, a utopia in the literal sense, a fusion of suggestions, glances, half-glimpsed faces, and incoherent gestures unburdened by the distractions of car horns, street smells, or the hum of the crowd. That's really nicely put.
Yes, I love these lines, now that you read it, because I think it really does capture what was for him a no place, and that allows you, in a sense, more freedom. To a certain extent, I feel that way here in Columbus. People say, "Oh, why you continue to live in Columbus?" Columbus gives me that freedom that a big city perhaps does not. A big city then overwhelms you with its greatness, and you succumb to it. A place like Columbus does not.
Hmm. It's amazing too when you think about Cavafy's actual sphere towards the end of his life, or in his later years when he stopped traveling. His Alexandria was limited to the radius of his like a 15-minute walk from his apartment to his office and back again. We should say something about his office too and his work. Like he was working at the same time as.
Yeah, so this was his world. He would leave, and in the chapter on Alexandria, we recount how he would, saunter, go to his office, which was only 15 minutes away. So he worked for the Department of Irrigation. And again, he worked as what we would say is a petty civil servant. He didn't want to rise up. He was given the opportunity to work for the Benaki family or bankers to make more money. But he really wanted his freedom. He would come home after work in the afternoon. He was, in a sense, a scribe. He would copy documents, proofread documents, and people wondered, how can such a great mind be satisfied by such menial work? But again, his secret was that wasn't his identity. His identity was not that of a scribe. His identity was the poet. So he wanted to go home where he was free to craft his poems. And in his world, he was as limited as Kant. This was a great German philosopher who would go for his walks and come back. But his mind was free. And so was Cavafy. His imagination was free to travel through the ages and through the Mediterranean unencumbered by great monuments.
Well, the job makes total sense to me because he's buying time to write. This meets the necessities of daily life and buys him, doesn't steal his mind, but buys him the time to spend the rest of his time working on what he wanted to work on.
And yes, exactly. Many people do this. I have a friend who lives in Utah. He does what he does, but what he really wants to do is climb, ski, do all these sports and that work is a means to get that. And that was for Cavafy. He didn't want his work he didn't want to distinguish himself as a bureaucrat.
Yes, that makes sense to me. You risk responsibility. So you said at some point in his life, you said that he abandoned love for the sake of fame and success. So what did that look like in his later years?
Well, that was a gradual process. I mean, obviously, for the sake of writing a book, one makes this simplistic. It was a process that took over decades. I would say that he began to think of himself more seriously as an artist in the 90s. And I think in the early sort of 20th century, he renounced most of everything that was written, as I said, which it must have been a horrible task to do as a writer. Imagine, Ryan, just abandoning everything, almost 90% of what you had written, and no longer associating yourself with that. That's what he did because he knew it was a dead end. It would not lead him to greatness. So I would say it was a gradual process that was completed by 1911. And he himself said 1911 was his annus mirabilis. That is when he decided that he was a different person. Now, it's too simplistic. It's easy for him and for us to give 1911 as a magical date, but it was, I would say, a process of 20 years in the making, and it was gradual, involving conscious and unconscious factors such as the effect on him of the deaths, of his own sexual identity, of the social fall, and his gradual desire and unstopping desire to write poetry, not only to write poetry, but to write great poetry. And then I think he gradually realized that love would no longer satisfy him. It wasn't really the answer he was looking for. It disappointed him in the past, so he turned then his poetry, his art, into salvation. And there is a chilling line that we quote when he says, "Here I am, such a genius and not being recognized. And at one point he said, at one point I thought, if I don't get recognized, if I don't achieve what I thought that I would rather die. There were in the past, he could say what most of us would say. At least we have love. We have our family. We have our partners, our children, our friends. For him, what was the true salvation was poetry. So he surrendered to poetry. That would determine his life. And that's, I think, what we mean, that love, he gave up on it as the ideal. And for then on, what he aspired to was not only writing poetry, but writing great, original, path-breaking poetry that would be remembered decades later, and that some people would be doing a podcast on him.
So you said it. So at this point, friendship for Cavafy became a matter of convenience, that you say, reserved for those evangelicals who served his literary career.
And that was, for me, perhaps the greatest insight that I gained about human character, is how somebody attains greatness. Because I think by reading him, I discovered this link between the fan and the star. And so the fan gives something of himself, and the star surrenders his ego and does everything possible in order to gain favor with the fan. So remember when I said that Cavafy became the great influencer? Well, he determined then that he could achieve this goal by persuading a group of fanatical advocates, disciples, who would, in a sense, take his poetry like apostles and spread the message all over the world. And that's what he did. And we have examples of young men, in a sense, who make it their prime goal to promote his poetry. And over again, we cite them, how meeting him becomes, for them, a life-changing experience. And then they say, after this, my goal was to promote Cavafy's poetry. For me, in terms of psychology, it is interesting. Why does one submerge their own ego, their own sense of individuality, in order to promote someone else's work? What is it that one gains through this? And in fact, the famous case of Iannos that we discussed, he became often, in a sense, disbarred. He became, in Athens, people shunted him because he supported Cavafy and not the reigning Greek poet of Palamas. He was closed away from many literary circles in Athens because of his support for Cavafy. Why would anyone do this? It's poetry, after all. But I think it's that recognition that somehow you're serving greatness, and that shine is going to, in a sense, come off of you. And to a certain extent, if we know them because they're footnotes to Cavafy right now, otherwise would have been forgotten. So for me, as I said, it was this insight that he had into human character, that he thought that the best way to achieve fame was to persuade these people who would then become the disciples, the apostles, to spread the message. And again, it worked spectacularly.
He really was a master self-promoter. Like he even used what's in the internet world we would call sock puppets. Like he wrote articles promoting himself or defending himself, and then got others to publish them under their names. That's pretty clever. Absolutely. Shameless but clever.
It is, and in a sense, you really did this. In fact, there is a case where a French journalist came to see him, and he actually wrote what the journalist should write and read it in front of him and said, this is what you should write. He had a magazine that was published by Alexandria Enrica, his heirs, on the apartment below, that was, in a sense, a mouthpiece for him. It was promoting his work. He never published anything under his name, but he was, in a sense, the organ behind him. And then when the Council General of Greece published this very important work on the Greeks of Egypt and had a huge section on Alexandria's literary production, it is suspected that the section on Cavafy was written by the poet himself. He wrote, in a sense, Ryan, his own letters of recommendation and his own press releases.
That's great. You got a great quote here, too. He said, when a group of students once asked him who he thought Greece's best poet was, he answered, "You mean after me?" And then listed out some people. That's fantastic. So, but despite all this hunger for fame, he never sold a book in his lifetime. Instead, he circulated broadsheets and pamphlets and sewn notebooks. So he really built his reputation poem by poem. That's very unusual.
And that's, again, is another mark of his genius, if I can repeat this phrase that I'm sure the listeners are now getting tired of, is he never published. Again, when you think of most authors, most of us want to publish as much as we can. And now I have colleagues who are my age who are publishing their collected work, all their articles, all their essays are published together. He never wanted a finished product. He circulated the poems individually as broadsheets, and then he would print some of them as pamphlets or booklets. Sometimes he would ask people to send back the originals. He would revise them. So I think he did this in order to control the means of distribution and, to a certain extent, the means of reception and the means of consumption. Since there wasn't no finished product, he felt he could control the way then the poetry was received and read. And this is why he resisted a full translation of his work. So here you had E.M. Forster, one of the greatest living British novelists at the time, who was begging him to publish through one of the leading publishing houses in London a work, something that most poets would immediately accept it. He resisted because I think he feared the translation would, in a sense, freeze his work, and it would be one step removed away from his own influence. And so again, it's as if he had understood that the best way to become famous is through drips and that, to control the means of distribution by creating a desirable good that you don't flood. That's contrary to what we think. All the tweets, all the messages out there as quickly as possible for the greatest push and the greatest influence. He thought little by little. So people had to write to him and they said, hey, I heard that you wrote this poem, or I wrote this. I went to the bookstore in Berlin. I didn't find your books. Could you send me a copy? So everybody had to go through him. And that's the paradox. He was, in a sense, postmodern and antique at the same time. He really understood and wanted to change the path of poetry. He understood the way that poetry was understood, but he, in a sense, preferred face-to-face contact. And he wanted to send people his poetry, and then he would ask this couple that he knew, the Zelitises, to send this particular package. So everybody, there are records of people receiving these booklets or these pamphlets, and he kept records of each one that he had sent and when it was received. We have detailed records of this.
That's really interesting. He really understood what makes fame, like the scarcity, for one. That his work becomes much more valuable because it's so hard to get your hands on, but everybody knows about it as well because he's curated this image of himself. And then he's this distant, mysterious figure at a time when writers were distant and mysterious, not just psychologically or personally distant, like this sort of oracle that people go visit, but also physically distant in kind of a forgotten backwater that would have taken quite a lot of effort to get to. So he really seemed to be positioning himself not so much for fame in his lifetime, but for lasting fame afterwards.
And Ryan, that's, I think, what people in our age can't understand. When was the last time that you heard somebody that they wanted to write something for posterity? Rarely. We want instant impact, instant gratification. He looked at the game in the future. And that's really a tribute to him. In a sense, he delayed that gratification that all of us, in a sense, crave for. The reviews, the applause. I mean, he got it, but not to the same extent that he could have had he done things differently. But I think it's because he had an eye to the future. He had patience, and he could wait it out.
So Cavafy left an enormous amount of material behind him. Letters, diaries, photographs, drafts of poems, but also train tickets, lists of daily tasks, notes of family debts, menus. So what do these things tell us about him? And what does that sort of hoarding tell us about him?
I think it's sort of first about his obsessive personality. He left nothing unsaved. He was, in a sense, the unofficial archivist of the family. He also kept, sometimes, as I said, since his own, the people that received his letters mostly did not save them, but he kept copies of the letters. And I think two things come out of this. One, that he was really obsessive as a person who was interested in history. He was interested in maintaining his own archive, and then I have to say that he imagines that someday he hoped that someone would write his biography, and there was the archive containing everything. He kept everything, including train tickets. He was like the undergraduate student going abroad and coming back and doing a scrapbook. I mean, he did this with all the records. He had sometimes lists of things, lists of how to make tea, lists of which servant does what at any particular time. And that's another thing I thought when I first began looking at the archive. Why would someone with such brilliance be, in a sense, have to carry all the weight of this archive, all these possessions? But again, maybe they let him be free in a paradoxical way, because he had it stored there. And since he wrote about the past, he wanted, in a sense, to preserve this past, and probably he desired that somebody one day would write the biography.
So you've said that he was one of the first major modern poets to write openly about homosexuality, but he was guarded about his own romantic life and that we know very little about it. So does that matter that we don't know the details?
Yes and no. I mean, it doesn't matter for the poetry. It has no impact on our poetry at all, because on the one hand, as I say, if we compare him with E.M. Forster, who was his contemporary, he wrote his gay novel Morris, and it was not published posthumously until 1974, I think, or 76, one of those dates. Cavafy was very open from the beginning, both to his own circle of friends. Everybody in Alexandria knew about his homosexuality, and he talked about it openly. So the fact that he didn't has no impact on our understanding of his poetry. It does have an impact in our own understanding as a person. So for me, another disappointment, I thought there would be some revelations in the archive about his own sexual conduct, his lovers' letters. There was nothing there, which suggests that either he removed them or somebody else removed them, which often happens. People are very guarded, sort of the heirs are very guarded of their brothers, sisters, or the archive they received, and sometimes they remove material that they find disturbing. That often happens. So it could be possible that Rika and Alekos, his heirs, or somebody else could have removed material. But there is astonishingly very little for a person who wrote openly about gay love, who spoke about his own homosexuality, that the archive says very, very, very little about. It's what we call a silence of the archive. So you almost have to conjecture. You almost have to fill the gaps in a literary sense by writing a novel or something, or a short story, to make up for this gap, for the lack that exists in the archive.
So my last question, in looking at Cavafy's legacy, you said that he changed the fate of Greek and world poetry. How did he change it, and how do you think he'll be remembered?
I think he changed it in many ways. For example, he turned attention away from classical Athens in the 5th century to these less, quote, desired periods of Greek history. And to that extent, he wrote about globalization, interethnic mixing, ethnic fusion, racial fusion, 100 years before other people started writing about it. He brought attention to the Greek language and made Greek readers aware of their language, because usually language is something invisible. We are not conscious when we're speaking right now of the thickness of language, but by including material from the whole diachronic history of Greek, he made Greek readers, conscious of the Greek language had this long, long tradition, and he made them aware as if like they were reading a translation. Another reason is that, and most important, is that he very bravely spoke about homoerotic love in his poetry at a time when very few other people were doing. And he also spoke about memory, the evocation of space, of the outsider, and I think made many people aware who are living in cities dealing with isolation and loss. They found some have found some refuge and some meaning in Cavafy's poetry. So I would say for all these reasons, he will be remembered. Now, for how long, I don't know, but for a long time, I think he's going to be part of the literary canon, both in Greece and in abroad as part of world literature.
I think we should give one final example before we close out here. So would you read us out with a poem? And I think it's my favorite Cavafy poem, the one that you chose.
So I would like to read Ithaca, and this is one of his most popular poems, and it refers to the island of Ithaca, which is where the Homeric hero Odysseus came from. And so in Homer, in the Odyssey, Odysseus longs to return home because he has spent 10 years fighting in the Trojan War and 10 years returning home. Cavafy has Odysseus leaving Troy for Ithaca. But the message here is, rather than speeding to get home as quickly as possible, he says that Odysseus should take as long as possible. The poem is written in the second person, so it's addressed to Odysseus, but it's really addressed to the reader or to our listeners right now. And the advice he gives is, you have only one life to live. This is the one journey you really don't want to speed at all. So I will begin. And this is our own translation. As you set out for Ithaca, pray that the way be long, full of exploration, full of learning. The Laestrygonians, the Cyclopes, furious Poseidon, don't fear them. You won't encounter them along the way if you keep your mind on higher things, if a fine essence moves your spirit and your body. The Laestrygonians, the Cyclopes, furious Poseidon, you won't encounter them if you don't harbor them inside your soul, if your soul doesn't conjure before you. Pray that the voyage be long. May you have many summer mornings when, with such delight, such joy, you arrived at unexplored ports. Pause at Phoenician trading posts and acquire fine merchandise, mother of pearl, coral, amber, ebony, heady fragrances of every kind, as many heady fragrances as you can. Visit many Egyptian cities, learn from their scholars, and learn even more. Keep Ithaca always in your mind. To arrive there is your destination, but don't hasten your journey in the least. It's best that it take many years, so you're old when you land on the island, rich with what you found along the way, not expecting Ithaca to give you wealth. Ithaca offered you the magnificent journey. Without her, you would not have set out. She has nothing else to give you. And if you find her poor, Ithaca has not deceived you. As wise as you become, with such experience, you will have grasped what Ithacas like these mean.
Beautiful. So thank you for your time today, Gregory. You've given us a fascinating glimpse into a man who seemed to live outside his own time and who captured the sense of dissolution inherent in ours.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you and to sharing with your listeners my love of Cavafy, the person and the poetry. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.